Well, maybe we need some places where we don't mess with them so that they can propagate and spread out to other areas. So we create refuge areas, no hunting areas. We get rid of them from some places and we want to put them back like we did with deer and the turkeys in the mid-1900s. So propagation, artificial replenishment. And then finally, the last thing that cultures often get to is manipulating the environment, controlling diseases, improving the habitat. And like some of you might remember me saying in the past, that last thing we do, improving the quality of habitat, is very often all we need to do. If we do that well, sometimes we don't need to do much of that other stuff. So ironically, that should be the first thing we do. It's all about habitat management. I should have asked you Monday, when you think of habitat management, managing habitats for wildlife. I know this is a very broad general question, it's wide open. What do you think about?
Clear cutting.
You think of clear cutting? Do you think of that as a good thing or a bad thing? As a bad thing? Yeah, that's a lot of people when they think, oh yeah, we're destroying habitat because we're cutting down all the forests, right? Yeah, and clear cutting, if you haven't been exposed to this idea yet, I will expose it to you. That it's a tool like a shovel. You can use it to dig a hole and plant a tree, or you can use it to bonk somebody over the head. It can be good or bad. It's just all in how you use it, right? So yeah, that's actually what a lot of people think. That's good. Liv, what were you going to say?
Like controlled burns, I guess.
Okay, yeah. So controlled burning is definitely a habitat management tool and a very fun one for me and some people. And we'll be talking about that here in just a little bit as a type of maintaining succession. And succession is something that is, if you don't love the concept, the idea of plant succession now, I hope you do before the semester is over, because it's an amazing and fascinating and a multifaceted concept. What else do you think of with regard to habitats? What are some major habitats that you think of?
Wetlands.
Wetlands, excellent, good. Ducks and shorebirds and waterbirds and a lot more wildlife live in wetlands than anywhere else in Tennessee. What else? What's that?
Grasslands.
Grasslands, yeah, and that's actually one that is just starting to receive its due attention. As Skylar, as you know, grassland birds have suffered more than any other group of birds in the United States over the past half a century. And part of the reason might be that just grasslands aren't sexy. It's easy to get people on board with stop clear cutting. Stop clear cutting our beautiful forests. Stop draining our wetlands. But stop screwing with our grasslands. People don't see, there's lots of grasslands out there. They're everywhere. Just look where there's cattle, there's grasslands. But they're modified. They're different. They're messed up. Yeah. Good. Oh, and I have put these on Canvas. So these PowerPoints are on Canvas if you want to access them. We'll go back to the grade school definition. What is habitat? It's all the things that wildlife need to survive, and the four components are food, cover, water, and space, right? Food and cover are those basic tangible things. Water is tangible too, but it's more important than just structure. It is substrate for many species. Fish and amphibians have to have it, right? Everything has to drink it for the most part, except for things like kangaroo rats, which can metabolize water. But those first three things are tangibles. Space is the intangible because you can't touch it. An individual animal needs enough space to gather all the food resources it needs and to find the cover it needs to survive at all different times of year and situations, and to find enough water. And the higher the quality of the habitat, the less space an individual animal needs, right? And the less it has to move, the less stress it is. We like to move, but for an animal that has to do it on their own, it takes away from their fitness. And then you also have to have enough space, not just for the individual, but to have enough individuals interacting with each other to have a population that's big enough to sustain itself, right? So if a squirrel needs an acre, I'm simplifying dramatically here, and you've got 5 acres, you've got enough habitat for 5 squirrels, if they're all defending their territory. 5 squirrels isn't enough for a sustainable population. How many acres do you need for a sustainable population of squirrels. It depends on the species. It depends on whether they're R-selected or K-selected and whether they're a predator or prey and lots of other things. For some species, you need enough, like for K-selected species, big animals that live for a long time, you need enough for just maybe 2 or 3 or 4 dozen individuals, at least. For R-selected species, you might need enough for thousands of individuals. So how much space do you need? But that's a very important critical component of habitat. You can, on the farm that you do a management plan on, like I said the other day, they can optimize the quality of their quail habitat. But if it's surrounded by bean fields or subdivisions, that's useless. You're not going to have quail. You have to have enough for all quail. And Caitlin, you already look sad. Okay, it's going to be a long afternoon. Oh man, I'll try to keep it interesting or make it interesting here and there. We'll talk about each of these things in turn. Feel free to jump in with questions or comments or arguments if you want to argue with me. I welcome it. Okay. All right. So we often think very simplistically. The general public does about food. Squirrels eat nuts, acorns, right? But in the summer, squirrels are eating all sorts of different things, right? A lot of animals are generalists in the summer when there's a lot of food resources, and they become specialists in the winter. Ruffed grouse, you guys might have heard me talk about that species before. Once or twice, maybe. That's my master's thesis project. You're going to get sick of hearing me talk about it. Ruffed grouse in the northeastern United States, you know what they eat in the wintertime? One thing.
What?
Aspen cat. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you. That's a great question. Aspen catkins, and that's what they eat in the winter. That's it. They're a specialist in the winter. Eat all sorts of shit in the summertime, but that's it in the wintertime. Okay. Here in the southeastern United States, in East Tennessee, do we have aspens? No, we do not. So they've got to make do with 3 primary things. Any guesses? Something that's green.
Grass.
Grass? No, not grass. They are not cows. They do not metabolize cellulose. No. That's because you're a good guy. Good try. Greenbrier, okay, smilax, and I'll show you that sometime this semester. Christmas fern and mountain laurel leaves. And that's it. That's what they eat in East Tennessee in the winter. They're specialists. Sage grouse eat Wyoming big sage in the wintertime. Spruce grouse eat spruce needles. Blue grouse, dusky and sooty grouse eat primarily Douglas fir needles. They're specialists. In the summer, they eat all sorts of stuff. But it also differs by things like the sex and age of the individual. Late winter, around here, female ducks start really homing in on something more than, now, male and female ducks both start homing in on something different than they've had during the winter. What do you think it is? Invertebrates. Why? What do invertebrates have more than seeds? Protein. And why are ducks, just before springtime and late winter, needing a lot of protein?
Migration.
They're going to need protein for migration. Okay, why else? Egg laying. What else? What does protein provide that what do you get from bread? Carbohydrates don't provide. What's that?
Long-lasting energy.
What?
Long-lasting energy.
That's more fat. Protein gives you quick energy too.
Like nucleic acids.
They give you enzymes for production of new cells. Okay, so what new things are ducks going to be? Yeah, they're going to be molting. Right, that's right. And they're going to be migrating. They need that energy. All these things, right? So they're eating invertebrates, and also it's good because vertebrates are starting to become more available as you get into late winter, early spring. And female ducks are keying in on not just invertebrates, but something else. Anybody know? Calcium from what? Like fingernail clams and pea clams and freshwater shrimp. They have those exoskeletons that have the calcium, and that calcium serves egg laying, right? Egg production. So there's, we could go on and on. Every species has this story of differences in food over different times of year, but among different sexes and among different ages, right? First 2 weeks of life among most granivorous birds like grouse and ducks, what are they eating? Entirely invertebrates. Why? Because they're growing like crazy, so they need that protein. And that changes as they get older. They don't need that because they're not growing as much. So that all differs depending on all these things, where you are. And food is complex. You know, not all food is equal. You've got what they would prefer to have if they had every possible choice, but you know, maybe what's the perfect food for them isn't very available. So what they get by on most of the time, you know, ramen noodles, mac and cheese, or whatever, right? Emergency is like, oh, there's no ramen noodles. I'm gonna have to eat those jam year-old rice cakes in the back of the pantry, but it'll get me by, right? And stuffer is when an animal is starving and they're not getting any nutritional value out of it at all. They're just filling the void. They're just putting stuff inside. So a duck might prefer corn, eat millet as a staple, eat soybeans in an emergency, and stuff on Johnson grass seed, you know, or whatever. That's just an example. Okay. Likewise, cover is complex. You know, we think bats live in caves and squirrels live in trees, right? But wildlife need lots of different types of cover for different purposes at different times of year, among different ages and sexes in different parts of the country. So, you know, they need roosting cover, and that might differ between summer and wintertime. Escape cover, feeding cover, loafing cover, nesting cover, root rearing, and some of these might be similar. They might have similar characteristics. One habitat might work for one species for 2 or 3 of these purposes. And usually when we think of cover, we think of vegetation, but it's not always just vegetation, is it, right? So, you know, you've got soil, you know, all fossorial species or species that dig dens, soil is an important cover. Caves and cliffs. What's the term for landscapes that are frequently characterized by caves and sinkholes? Does anybody know? What type of topography is it called? Who knows the term for it? What?
Depression.
Can't have depressions. Starts with a K. Karst. That's right. Yeah. Good job. K-A-R-S-T. Karst topography is topography characterized by caves and sinkholes. We often see that where we have limestone parent material. Why would that be?
So it gets washed away easily.
Yeah, because it's calcium based and water just washes that away. So you get caves. Where do we have a lot of caves in Tennessee? Do we have a lot here in West Tennessee? Nope. We have a lot of lurs in West Tennessee. Caves, we see a lot. Middle Tennessee, the Plateau, East Tennessee. Tennessee has thousands of caves, actually. And some bats they roost in caves all year. Some bat species roost in caves in the wintertime. Some bat species don't roost in caves, or they don't necessarily. They're not obligatory related to caves at all. So you've got caves. Snow roosting. There's some species that roost in snow. Ruffed grouse in the northeastern United States in the wintertime. Often you can, if you can see a brood of them up on a tree limb around dusk as it's getting dark in deep snow, one of them will right in dusk, it'll peel off that tree limb and just go down into the snowbank, and the others will follow just like footballs, dunk, 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 and they just go down into the snow, and then they haul it out with their wings. They've got a warm hollow, and predators can't find them, and it's a very thermally, you know, since they're endothermic, they heat it up, and it works great. You might get sick of me talking about dead wood before this semester is over. Dead wood, not like old faculty like myself, but dead wood like what you find in woods, and it's critically important, more so than we understand. In the Southeast, I would say that we're probably about 40 years behind, say, the Pacific Northwest in understanding the critical importance of dead wood and how wildlife are related to it. And we'll talk more about that this semester. Landscape contour, we'll talk about aspect. What does aspect refer to with regard to slope? It refers to the direction of the slope. Is it north facing specifically or south facing? What would be the difference? the significance of north-facing versus south-facing slopes, or north aspect versus south aspect.
Direction of the sun?
Right. So at midday, where is the sun? No. Why isn't it above you? Where would you have to be for it to be above you? On the equator. But we're in the northern hemisphere. So at midday, where is the sun? Just a little bit south. Just a little bit south of you. Okay? Now, with that information, what is the difference between north and south aspects? Come on, wake up. Sun is south of you. What's the difference between a north and a south aspect? There's south. Here's the sun. South aspect, north aspect.
You don't have as much sun blaring
Yeah,
on
if
you.
you're on the north aspect, there wouldn't be as much sun.
Right. Yeah. So north aspects tend to be shadier, cooler. You get more water retained. It's not evaporating as much. So you have more lush vegetation. You eventually have more organic matter that builds, and so you'll often have species that can handle drier, less fertile conditions on south slopes, like pines, and species that need more moist, fertile conditions on north slopes. Right. So and what vegetation you have dictates what animals you have. So that too is a critical and important part of cover. I give examples. There are a million different unique relationships that species have, and we don't know them all. When I studied blue grouse in Oregon, the biologists had a question. They said, there's where we see mistletoe out here, we see a lot of grouse droppings in the tree, and we don't understand what's going on. Can you help us figure that out? That was a side question I had. Mistletoe in the Pacific Northwest manifests differently than here. Here you got, mistletoe. There, these conifer trees, the mistletoe grows, and you don't usually see the mistletoe leaves, but the tree, as a physiological response to the mistletoe infestation, will grow a dense cluster of stems and needles. These are conifer trees, okay? And those clusters will get bigger and bigger, and frequently they're, bigger than this. I've seen them once or twice as big as a school bus, this on a tree, that went from 5 feet off the ground to 50 feet off the ground. Just huge, half as big around as this room right here, giant. So thick that you could hardly shove your hand into it. And you see a bunch of grouse droppings underneath it. So when I followed these grouse around with radio telemetry over the course of the winter, I found one group that used mistletoe infested trees about 33% of the time, 1/3 of the time, and it was immature females. Immature males, adult females, adult males, not so much. Immature females about 1/3 of the time. Why? They were the smallest of the grouse. If an eagle came after a big old honking male blue grouse, now blue grouse, he'd fight back. Maybe even a female or a juvenile male could fly away. Those little bitty females, though, they were small enough they could get inside. They called those big clusters of mistletoe infested trees witches' brooms. They would get inside those witches' brooms, and they could hang out, and it was great thermal cover, and there was needles everywhere for food. That's what they ate in the winter, and the eagles couldn't get to them. So it was different for them. They used and benefited from that disease more than others. I go on and on and on with these unique relationships that wildlife have with habitats that we really are, there's a million things yet that we haven't figured out. We have yet to understand. So, of course, all wildlife need water to drink. Some species have to have it, and if you look at the endangered species list in Tennessee, that's where it's at, right? What's our most endangered group of animals in Tennessee? Mussels, freshwater mussels, right? Second most endangered group, the fish, right? 17 federally endangered species or so in Tennessee, right? Crayfish and several of the mammals, are usually around water. So water's critical, and not just any old water. Some things need something very specific. For a puddle duck, a mallard, water about 6 to 8 inches deep is optimal, less than 1.5 feet for just tipping up and feeding, right? For shorebirds, depending on the species of shorebird, whose legs might be this long or this long or this long, the depth of the water, 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters is critical, and that's where they'll feed. So the characteristics of the water are important. Clean water, of course, is critical. Space, they all have to have it. Carnivores need more than herbivores because they're having to range more widely to find animals to feed on. Large animals need more than small animals. You need more space as habitat quality decreases. And you have to consider dispersing individual animals as well as animals that migrate. If you've got imagine a national forest where the forest manager says, okay, we don't want to put in too many clear cuts. So we're going to try to keep clear cuts about a mile apart. So we'll put in a clear cut here, a mile away, another clear cut here, 20, 30 acres, another one over here, a mile apart. But you've got a species that depends on early successional forest habitat that's living in that clear cut area for the next few years. But their dispersal distance for the young is about 1/4 of a mile. So the young try to disperse, but they never can find another clear cut, right? What can they find instead? Well, if we've got natural disturbances happening that a clear cut is mimicking, they can use that. But if we know that, hey, this early successional forest species needs these early successional habitats, let's base our management on that to facilitate their dispersal and movement and metapopulation dynamics. We're doing good. Makes sense? So this is actually from an early class. We talk about habitat destruction, and it's hard to destroy habitat because anytime you alter it, you're making it bad for somebody and good for somebody else, right? A clear cut is bad for squirrels maybe, but good for bluebirds and rabbits, right? So we're just changing it. What does it take to destroy habitat? Sterilizing the soil, getting rid of all the organic matter, right? So it takes like a nuclear war or a volcano or something that's epic. More often what we do is degrade or fragment habitat. We make it not so good for a species. A clear cut for a little while might be bad for squirrels, but it might be good for something else. And eventually it'll be fine for squirrels again. And I think you guys know and understand fragmentation. That's where with our roads, with our subdivisions, our cities, with a million things, with dams, we fragment habitat into smaller and smaller pieces so that animals can't live in those smaller and smaller pieces, or they can't get from one place to another. We slow down their metapopulation dynamics. So you might still have almost as much habitat as you had before, but it's so chopped up that it's useless, right? There's many reasons why mussels are the most endangered species of animal in Tennessee, this most endangered group of animal. But if you consider how difficult it is for a mussel to disperse, and you put a dam in a river, you can be pretty sure that you're not going to have a whole lot of dispersal through that dam and past the reservoir on the upside of it. And if you've got a dozen dams all along a major river, you can be pretty damn sure that you're going to screw up, dispersal of all the mussels and the fish that live in it too. Right? How much have you had plant succession in classes? Some. What classes have discussed plant succession?
Plant ecology.
Plant ecology. What else?
Dendrology.
What's that?
Dendrology.
Dendrology. Okay. Plant succession is the change in plant species composition over time, usually following a disturbance. How do you think I'm defining disturbance?
Whether natural or human.
It can
Like
be either. It can be either anthropogenic or natural, but what is it?
Taking away something on an area.
Okay. Generally, specifically vegetation. Anything that removes vegetation from landscape, right? So, what's an example of an anthropogenic disturbance? Garrett?
Clear cut.
Clear cut. What's another?
Fire.
Fire. Good. What's another?
Horn
Not anthropogenic, but definitely a natural one for sure. Yeah. Would you say?
Cattle grazing.
Grazing, yes. Anthropogenic, cattle grazing, natural, wildlife grazing. Bison, elk, yeah, good. What's another? Either anthropogenic or natural.
Humans creating roads.
Roads, yeah. Anything that involves, plowing, disking, bush hogging, whatever. Yeah, good.
Natural disasters.
Natural disasters, ice storms, floods is a big one, right? Any natural disaster. The fires in Maui, bless their hearts. What else? Well, you could go on. That's you get insects and diseases, all those things. So imagine you've got a really big disturbance that just removes all the vegetation from thousands of acres, right? Let's say the disturbance was a clear cut, okay? No, we're not going to go there. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. A fire, it kills everything, all right? If you don't do anything to that area, are plants going to start growing the next year?
More or less, depending on the plant.
They will, yeah, it depends on the plant. So you might not get an oak tree growing back the next year, but what type of plant might you get growing back?
Grasses, shrubs.
Okay, okay, what are our options? We've got trees, shrubs. What's a shrub?
Little bush.
A small woody plant, yeah. So a tree is a big woody plant, a tall woody plant. A shrub is a short one. How tall does it have to be to go from shrub to tree? Depends on who you talk to. When does a pond become a lake? When does a stream become a river? Right? Usually they'll say about 10, 12 feet, 20 feet, something like that, and a shrub then becomes a tree. But I'm not going to get too big with that. So you got trees, shrubs. Those are both woody. So you said grasses.
Pines.
Hmm?
Pines.
Pines are trees. Good. Evergreen trees. Yeah. Okay. What a grass is non-woody. Is there anything else besides grasses that are non-woody?
Native flowers.
And flowers we would classify as what? Forbs. Herbaceous vegetation. Herbs or forbs, okay? Which is a non-woody vegetation other than grass, okay? And then you've got lianas, which is vines, but those are the main ones. Trees, shrubs, grasses, and forbs, okay? What do you think of all those is usually the first thing, the most of that you're gonna get right after, the year after a big disturbance?
Grass.
No. If you put a bucket upside down in your yard and leave it for a week in this weather, take the bucket away, you've killed all the grass, what grows before grass?
Weeds.
Come on, I just gave you the term. Forbs. Herbs. What is a weed? No, it is not a flower. What is a weed?
A plant people don't want.
It's a plant out of place, an undesired plant, right? And if it's a native forb to us, wildlifers, is it a weed? No, man, it's good stuff. Yeah, we want it. All right. So the first thing that grows after a disturbance usually is forbs. And you'll see a little bit of grass, but you really start seeing grass year 2, year 3. Okay? Year 3, year 4, then what do you start seeing a little bit more of? Woody stuff. And maybe shrubs, but maybe something that's kind of intermediate, like blackberry canes and stuff like that. Then you start seeing shrubs, right? And then you start seeing trees after the next, after you get year 5, 6, 7, 8. More and more trees, but not so much like oaks and hickories. You see some other species of trees, like what?
Birch.
In some places, birch, okay, especially if there's water near. Maybe some maple.
Pine.
Maybe more likely some pine, especially if you're in this part of the world.
Trees that are tolerant of the sun.
That are tolerant of the sun.
Yes.
And by extension, you mean intolerant of shade.
Yes.
That's right. You see shade intolerant species. Many of these species are what a lot of people would call weedy species, okay? They are selected. They grow very quickly. And they often don't grow very, very tall, and they often don't live very long, okay? They're the first trees in. They're often light-seeded, and they come in fast, so it could be things like redbud, around water, cottonwood, sycamores, sweet gums, okay? So they'll come in and they'll grow fast. They don't grow often very huge, And then more shade tolerance start coming in behind them. Yeah, oaks and hickories and maples, although some are somewhat shaded. And they will eventually outgrow and shade out those early successional pioneers, those pioneer species. And so then you have that later successional oak forest, right? How old are most of our hardwood forests in the south, in the eastern United States, roughly?
100 years old.
Maybe 80 to 100 years old. Because 80 to 100 years ago, we clear cut most of the eastern United States, and what forests we've allowed to grow back have got to that age. For hardwoods, for oaks, for managing them for timber, cutting timber, for saw timber, for lumber, what is a common rotational age? At what age roughly do we often harvest hardwoods?
30 or 40?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. More like about 80 years, okay? And a lot of timber managers would say that a forest that's around 100 years old is over mature, because those trees, once they get full size, they, like animals, they don't grow as fast. So it's like, well, it's as big as it's gonna get almost, so cut it down and make your money and let other trees start growing if they're trying to make money, right? But those trees stop growing so fast. They're still getting bigger slowly. But what do they start to do once they get old? Same thing people do when we get old. We start falling apart. We start senescing. They start getting heart rot and other issues. And the quality of the lumber goes down. So our forests, managed by timber managers who are all about economic profit, say, a 100-year-old, 120-year-old forest is a waste. Cut those trees and let new trees grow. In the Appalachians, what's the natural winter habitat for a black bear?
Big trees that are like, kind of make cover, like big old trees that like fall over.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Often a big old tree that hasn't fallen over yet, that has heart rot, that has a cavity. These dudes are hibernating in cavities of standing trees. How big does a tree have to be? How old does a tree have to be to get big enough, to get heart rot, and a large enough cavity to support a 300-pound bear? Older than 80 years. Older than 100, okay? What do we consider an old forest or an old growth forest? An 80 to 100-year-old forest is considered mature or just barely over mature, okay? It's not old growth. A lot of people arbitrarily use the term 200 years old for old growth. When forests succeed from forbs to grasses to shrubs to pioneer shade intolerant trees to the later successional trees, there eventually supposedly comes to a point where the changes slow down and what you have across the landscape becomes kind of consistent, okay? Now they're still dynamic, there's still change going on. A red oak in this part of the world on average lives maybe 150 years. That's their lifespan. A white oak might live about 300 years, okay? Depends, but generally. So you start after 150 years, around mid-century, you start losing red oaks. And when a red oak comes down and maybe takes a couple trees with it, you got a light gap in the forest canopy. Sunlight hits the forest floor. More trees start growing up. So intermixed with this older forest, you've got some patches of younger forest, right? And when you've got a forest that's maybe 200, 300, 400 years old, the idea is that the percentage of old forest and young forest, the composition of different species is kind of in flux. It's kind of found, it doesn't change too much anymore, right? And the question that forest ecologists often ask is, how old is that? Well, it depends on where you are, what forest it is. They thought in the coniferous forests of Western Oregon and the Cascades that an old growth forest state what they call a climax community or a shifting steady state, was reached at about 800 years old. But then they found some forests that were around 1,200 to 1,400 years old in the backcountry in some of these national forests. And they were seeing that they were starting to shift from predominantly Douglas fir to western hemlock. And they extrapolated and said, look, it looks like after about 1,400, 1,500, 1,600 years, this is going to be a western hemlock dominated forest. That is to say, an old growth forest didn't occur at 800 or 1,200 or 1,400 years. It might occur at 1,500, 1,600 years. That's complex, man. We talk about an old forest being 80 years old. That's just barely mature, right? We've lost about a third of our forests in the United States, but we've lost about 95% of our old forests, right? And most of our species that we have of wildlife today do just fine in young forests. That's because the species that need old forests are gone. We got rid of them. There's still some that would do better in an old forest. We can get old forests back, but we have to plan for it because it's going to take a century or two or more to get those things back. Now I'm talking about that. This is a photo I took of my clear cut on the Cherokee National Forest back in the 1980s, a young regenerating clear cut. In about 3 or 4 years, those forbs and grasses and shrubs that are just starting to grow will grow big enough so that it'll be great rough grouse habitat. Not quite there yet. So plant succession, where vegetated communities go from bare soil following a disturbance to climax communities, or better called a shifting steady state, where the composition stays the same, but where the patches of old and young forest are kind of moving around, right? Clementsian succession. Clements suggested that what you have as succession occurs is you got a bunch of species of plants that grow and live, and then they're replaced by a different guild, a different grouping of plants, and then they're replaced by another. And Gleason came along later and said, yeah, it's not that simple, okay? You've got some species of plants that you'll have for the first year or two and they drop out, but you've got other species that start living the first year or two, and they will occur throughout the next century or two in that forest. Maybe in mid-succession they'll go down, but as you get an old growth forest, their percentage will go up again. So it differs. There's some that are early, some that are late, some that are middle, some that do this. So the species composition in forests is an ever-shifting thing. A central hardwood forest reaches eventually a successional steady state. The pond in my backyard, if I leave it alone, what will it eventually become? A central hardwood forest, right? Prairies are maintained by grazing and by fire as a steady state, as a climax community. We often think of a grassland as not a mature forest, but it is a mature ecosystem that is maintained by disturbance. If we get rid of all the grazing animals and we get rid of all the fire, what will happen to the where's the yardstick? The yardstick's gone. Our pointer's gone. What will happen to the tall grass prairie? It would turn into forest. What would happen to the short grass prairie? Probably not too much, because it doesn't get enough water to grow very many trees, right? So, depending on where you are, early successional habitats, non-forested habitats might change or they might not based on the history of natural disturbances. But as the plants change, animals change with them. So if you want to understand how to manage wildlife, you've got to understand the natural native plant succession where you are. And it's different everywhere. So I'm going to teach more about it in Tennessee, but if you go to Florida or Maine or South Africa or wherever you go, animals will follow the plants in succession. I'm doing this picture. How is it? Did I do pretty good?
Some of your best work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that greatly. Yeah, I can draw squiggly lines with the best of them, right? So you've got forbs and grasses and shrubs. This is over time. Your pioneer, early successional shade intolerance, your shade tolerance, and finally a climax community or that shifting steady state. So some terms are generalists, specialists, niche or niche, seer and guild. And some of these terms you're probably at least a little bit familiar with. A generalist is an animal or a plant that can make do anywhere. You put a coyote in an early successional habitat and they'll eat mice. Put it in a late successional habitat and they'll eat acorns. You know, put it in Memphis and they'll eat cats or pizza out of the dumpster or whatever, right? A specialist needs something very specific. You know, a specialist plant might only occur in a very narrow piece of that time spectrum. The niche is the role of that organism in its community, the role of a plant, the role of an animal. What does it feed? What feeds it? What does it compete with? How does it change or influence the community? Is it a keystone species that does good things for others or what? What is a seer? Who's heard of the term seral stage? Anybody heard of that before? A seral stage is often considered a successional stage. So where you've got forbs is a seral stage or a successional stage, and the seer is the grouping of plants that occurs at a successional stage. So a seer is these forbs, or these grasses, or these shrubs, or these pioneer trees, or whatever. Okay. So a seer is the grouping of species that occurs at a successional stage. Okay, and then and that can almost be used synonymously with guild. Is all the plants that tend to grow together. Okay, good. Pictures. I think I've got more pictures than words for the rest of my slides before we take a break in a few minutes. So these are some examples of steady states or climax communities, right? Desert systems in the Southwest. You heard about the Joshua trees burning this summer. That's old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, which is actually rainforest, not tropical, but it is rainforest habitat. What is that? What would you call that?
Trees.
There are trees. It is true. But would you call it a forest? If you weren't going to call it a forest, why wouldn't you?
It's very open.
Because there's not very many trees. It's open.
It's not dense enough.
Huh?
It's not dense enough.
Maybe not quite as dense as what we think of as a forest. Yeah. So what do you call an area characterized by trees with a fairly open canopy and a fair bit of grass or forb understory?
Savanna.
That's right, savanna. Yeah, this is a pine savanna. That's right. Yeah, and we're understanding more and more that a good bit of Tennessee that we think of as naturally forested habitat historically was savanna due to grazing animals and fire. So there's a lot of effort to restore savanna on the Cumberland Plateau, land between the lakes, Catoosa Wildlife Management Area. There at Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency had a fiasco a couple of years ago when they tried to do some savanna restoration where they planted monocultures in the past. Somebody had planted monocultures of loblolly pine. They were going to harvest that loblolly pine and restore pine oak savannas on the Bridgestone Firestone Wildlife Management Area on the plateau. And a bunch of people in the public said, "Don't cut those forests down, that's horrible, you're destroying nature." And TWRA was saying, we're restoring nature back to the way what used to be and what wildlife depend on. And you know, there's a biopolitical lesson that we've talked about in biopolitics. Anybody ever heard the term disclimax or disturbance climax? That's where humans come in and change it, and we create a stasis. We create an ecosystem that stays the same, but it's not natural, okay? So we can think of it as a climax community since it stays the same. So you go to Washington State and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of wheat on what we call the Palouse in southeastern Washington right there. And that's been wheat for decades, and actually we've lost more soil than we've harvested wheat there. Tremendous soil losses from erosion, but that's a disclimax. In a lot of the southeastern United States and other parts of the country. Oh, Oh, I didn't know I could do that. This is great. Okay, another part. Oh, this changes everything. Oh, this is great. I got my tool. I'm ready to go. Okay, so what do we call that? It's not a savanna. No.
Plantation.
It's a pine plantation. Yeah, it's a monoculture. It's one single species that biologically is a bit of a desert. There's not a whole lot that can live there, right? So we've converted a natural forest to a biological desert, monoculture. Maybe this was once upon a time a prairie or a grassland, but this grass is probably Kentucky 31 tall fescue, and those bovids are not native bovids. So we've changed it to a climax that supports cows and maybe a couple species of birds, but nowhere near as much as what it historically would have supported, right? You guys seen this picture? This is half a picture. Have you seen this before? I bet you have when I show you the rest of the picture. What do you think of that? It's kind of pretty. Sun, reflecting off the creek, and the deer, waiting, looking. It's very, very nice, peaceful sunset scene, right? And Gabby's like, I don't trust you. Like, something's going on. You can't understand a situation. You can't understand or appreciate the full extent of a habitat of where a species lives until you understand not just right there, but everything around it. Have you seen that picture before? This is a famous picture. This was taken by a U.S. Forest Service employee during a wildfire out west about 15 years ago, and he took it on the job, so it's public domain, so you can download this and use it yourself. Fire, Deer Creek, Google that, you'll probably find it, and you can put it on your computer or whatever. Okay. Get close, about 3 or 4 more slides, and we'll take a break. So, most habitat management is about managing succession, and usually that's about setting succession back. It would be easy to manage habitat if all we had to do was get it just the way we wanted it and we could walk away, but we can't, because succession happens. It turns it into something different. And sometimes that's good, and we can work with that, but sometimes it's bad. We've already talked about means of setting back succession of anthropogenic disturbance, right? So we said clear cutting, we said grazing with livestock, we said plowing, disking, you said wildfire, but prescribed fire as well, right? These are all ways that we can set back succession, yeah. Aldo Leopold, game management. The first slide was about those 5 tools or stages that cultures go through to manage wildlife. Controlling hunting, controlling predators, refugia, artificial replenishment, and environmental controls. Aldo Leopold also said this, and there's a famous quote in game management. Has anybody seen or heard this quote before? The central thesis of game management is this: game can be restored by the creative use of the same tools which have heretofore destroyed it. Axe, plow, cow, fire, and gun. Management is their purposeful and continuing alignment. How many of those 5 things involve setting back succession?
All of them.
You actually, I was going to say the first 4, but gun could be too. Gun
Kill
could be
animals
too.
and
Yeah, that's the animals. But certainly the first 4 involve setting back plant succession, and I didn't specify. So you're right, yeah. But that just tells you how much of wildlife management is about setting back succession. And those first 4, axe, plow, cow, and fire, are about setting back plant succession. He wrote that when he wrote Game Management. He published it in 1933, but we've got another big tool we use today, and several of you have used it a lot. What is it? Come on, nozzle heads. Nozzle heads. What does that refer to? People who use what? You guys are killing me. Herbicides. Herbicides. Yeah, that's a huge one. Herbicides and pesticides is a huge tool, and we can add that to our toolkit that wasn't a big thing in the 1930s, right, before World War II. Hey, wait a second. It's easy enough to set back succession, but advancing succession, just get out of the way and let it go, right? But are there any ways that we micromanage, that we facilitate succession. We know it's gonna happen, but is there anything that we can do to make it happen the way we want? That we can change the quality or the quantity of it? What? Like what?
Hunting?
Okay, with regard to animals, yeah. What about with regard to plants?
I was thinking when like the first like shade intolerant tree species start
Okay.
coming up, you could go in and like get rid of like the grasses that are already there.
Okay.
Just to advance it a little further.
Okay, so yeah, and I'll make that even broader. We can get rid of some plants to facilitate other plants, right? Okay. How did those pine plantations grow? How did they get there? We planted them, right? So if we want to change, we want to be sure that the next forest we have has a strong component of oaks, for example. We can plant oaks. They're going to come up on their own. If you cut down, I've got a bunch of oaks on my property. If I go home this evening and cut down an oak tree, is that tree done? The fact that I asked makes you think maybe not. What might happen to that tree after I cut it down?
Grow some mushrooms.
It might grow some mushrooms. You know what else will happen? A lot of the time you've seen it. A sprout comes up and starts growing. A limb comes up and starts growing. And that'll grow into a new tree. And that's called coppice regeneration. COPPICE, coppice regeneration. It does not happen with pines, but it happens with a lot of hardwoods.
Spell it one more time for me.
COPPICE. So if I've got an oak forest and I want to harvest it and be sure that the next forest that comes up is another oak forest, no problem, it's going to happen. I just cut down the oaks and they're going to grow back. But if I've got a forest full of maples and poplar and elm, and I harvest it and I hope an oak forest is going to grow back as soon as possible, I better go in and plant some oaks. Okay. Who's heard of our famous sycamore that used to be in the middle of the quad in front of the admin building? Big old honking tree. I think they might even have a plaque for it or something like that. There's a piece of. What can I do for you? Are you in this class?
I'm not here at the right time, am
What class are you looking for?
I? I think it's after this class.
This class meets for the rest of the afternoon. We've been meeting from 2 to 6. You might be here,
Natural
Ron.
resource management.
Which one?
Hold on. This isn't the first time I've done this.
It's like these guys needed a break.
I'm sorry. Yep. Fish and wildlife management techniques. It only meets on Monday, everybody, in case you're in that class.
Labs on Friday.
I'm sorry.
Labs on Friday. It's all good. Have a good one.
You too.
First week. Yeah, I forgot what I was talking about. Help me out.
Coppice regeneration.
The
Coppice,
big
yeah.
tree that
Yeah.
like.
Oh, the sycamore.
There we go.
Yeah.
I said sycamore sassafras. I'm sorry, it's a sassafras. It's a big sassafras tree. Go over to the middle of the quad where that sassafras tree used to be, and there's 4 young sassafras trees, or 3, growing from the roots of that tree. That's coppice regeneration. Same tree. Yeah. So.
That's where those little ones came from?
They were growing, coming up out of the roots before that tree was ever cut down. Yeah. Or right as the tree was cut down.
Yeah, you can still see the skeleton of the old tree still there.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a million ways that we can facilitate succession, sometimes naturally, sometimes artificially. Why did wood ducks decline in the late 1800s and early 1900s? That's right. They're cavity nesters. They needed hollows and dead trees, and those trees had to be big enough for a hollow to support a wood duck, right? And we harvested, 80% of our bottomland hardwood forests in Tennessee, most of our forests in the eastern United States. They just couldn't hardly find any cavities, but we brought them back. How did we do it?
Artificial cavities.
What's that?
Artificial cavities.
Yeah, wood duck boxes. We created artificial cavities. So we created old growth conditions artificially. Wood duck boxes wood ducks don't need wood duck boxes. They just need those old growth conditions. So these boxes are a stopgap measure. If we think of, well, as long as we have wood duck boxes, we'll have wood ducks. I don't like that thinking. It's a Band-Aid. That will get us through until we have that optimal natural habitat that used to be there for them. Big old honking trees in our wetlands, right? And we're working on growing those back over the state time. Cerulean warbler. Here's a forest canopy, the treetops, okay, Earl? Are you making fun of my?
No, it's beautiful.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, there's our forest canopy. All right, and once a forest gets really old, let's say this tree dies, and more sunlight gets this tree, and this tree gets more nutrients, so this tree grows up and gets taller. Okay, then what cerulean warblers do is the male gets in the very top of these, what we call super dominant canopy trees. The few trees. Hello, can I help you?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I wouldn't.
It's all right. First week. It's his first week stuff. Okay, it's all good. All right. So the males get in the top of these super dominant canopy trees, and they're calling, displaying for females, and the females, over here in the canopy can see them because these males are up on a stage, right? All right. So when do you get super dominant canopy trees? After 150, 200, 250 years. How old are our forests? 80 to 100 years. Do we have very many super dominant canopy trees? No, we do not, okay? So what we have is a bunch of trees with the same height, but if we can get rid of some of those trees, so you've got forest canopy here and a gap, and a little tree with a little bit of forest canopy here, and then more forest canopy over here, the gap can serve kind of as a stage. Not quite as good, but the females over here can see across this gap more easily than they could an undulating canopy, and more easily see the males. So we can take trees that are the tallest ones we can find. We've done some research on it, and they cut a few trees around them to kind of isolate them to sort of mimic that super dominant tree. Not quite as good, but another thing that's going to happen is that's going to facilitate that tree's growth, so it will be a real super dominant tree sooner. Does that make sense? This is just an example of how we can facilitate succession, not just backwards, but forwards, to create the conditions we want. And what are the conditions we want for if we want to manage for all native wildlife? Old
growth forest.
Whatever used to be there. Whatever was there historically is what wildlife are adapted to. So the more we can provide that, the more we're going to provide for everybody. Wildlife, fish, whatever. Okay. Let's take